Some nights, the darkness outside your window feels so complete, so gently absolute that it seems like it could last forever. Not frightening, not heavy, just still. The way darkness sometimes is when you are warm and quiet inside it. If this feels like a good place to rest tonight, you're welcome to stay. Now, let's drift. Because somewhere out there, beyond the edge of what we can see with our eyes, there are worlds where the darkness is not a nightly visitor. It is not something that comes and goes with the turning of a planet. On some worlds, the darkness is simply home, permanent, patient, settled into every stone and every sky. And the more scientists explore these places, the more they begin to wonder, not with alarm, but with a kind of quiet astonishment, what life, if anything, does in a place the sun never reaches. That question, soft as it sounds, turns out to be one of the most fascinating ones in all of planetary science, and tonight we're going to let it carry us very gently somewhere new. There is a phenomenon that astronomers have studied for a long time now, though it rarely makes much noise in the wider world. It is called tidal locking, and once you understand it even lightly, it changes the way you look up at the night sky. When one body in space orbits close enough to another, the gravitational pull between them does something remarkable over deep stretches of time. It slows the smaller body's rotation. Gradually, over millions and millions of years, the planet or moon stops spinning freely. It settles. It orients itself. One face turns permanently toward its star, held there by gravity like a gentle hand pressing one cheek toward the light, and the other side, the far side, settles permanently into shadow. Our own moon is tidally locked to Earth. That is why we always see the same face of it from here. The far side of the moon exists in a kind of permanent turning away. It receives no direct sunlight from our sun as seen from Earth. It has its own complicated relationship with light and dark, which is different from what most people imagine. But the principle is the same. Gravity given enough time is patient enough to stop a world mid-spin. Now scientists have found that this process is not unusual. In fact, researchers have come to understand that for planets orbiting very close to small cool stars, the kind astronomers call red dwarfs, tidal locking may be the rule rather than the exception, and red dwarfs, it turns out, are by far the most common type of star in our galaxy. There are more of them than any other kind, quiet and dim and ancient, scattered throughout the dark like embers left from older fires. Many of the planets circling these stars are likely tidally locked, which means that across the universe there may be an enormous number of worlds where one hemisphere never sees its sunrise, where one side of the sky holds a star fixed and unmoving forever, and on the other side, in the permanent night, no sun ever climbs the horizon, not once, not ever. There is a star system that scientists have returned to again and again in recent years. It sits about 40 light years from Earth, close in cosmic terms, though it would take longer than human civilization has existed to travel there. The star at its centre is called TRAPPIST-1. It is a small red dwarf, dim and cool, much less luminous than our Sun, and orbiting it are 7 rocky planets, several of which sit in the zone where liquid water might exist on the surface. 7 worlds, some of them almost certainly tidally locked. Researchers have found this system particularly compelling, not because it promises life, but because it asks such interesting questions. If a planet the size of Earth sits in the zone where temperatures could support liquid water, but one side of it faces the star forever, while the other side faces only the cold of space, what happens? What does the atmosphere do? What does the surface look like? And in the frozen, lightless half of that world, what would existence feel like if anything were there to feel it? Scientists are still exploring what the climates of tidally locked planets might actually be like. The models are complex and the answers change as better data arrives, but what has emerged from decades of modelling and observation is a portrait of a world deeply unlike our own, and yet in some ways hauntingly familiar. Imagine for a moment standing on the dark side of such a planet. There would be no sunrise to wait for, no pink edge appearing slowly at the horizon, no gradual warming of the air. The sky above you would be night, but a different kind of night than we know here. Our nights turn, they move. The stars drift slowly across the sky as the Earth rotates beneath us, and within hours the darkness gives way to a grey edge and then to light. But on this world the stars do not move. They are fixed above you, the same ones always unmoving in the dark. The sky is eternal. It may be that the temperature on this side never rises above a deep bone-quiet cold. Some models suggest that if a planet like this had no substantial atmosphere, the dark side could become so cold that even the air itself might freeze and drift down to the surface like snow, leaving no pressure, no wind, no sound. Just cold and stars and silence. And yet, and this is where it becomes interesting, not all models suggest this. Some scientists believe that a thick enough atmosphere could change everything, that the winds driven by the extreme temperature difference between the burning bright side and the frozen dark side could carry heat across the terminator, the line where day meets night, that the dark side, rather than being a place of absolute stillness, might instead be swept by vast constant winds, yes, carrying warmth in great slow rivers through the atmosphere, keeping temperatures just survivable, just above the point where all things would freeze. There are still quiet questions around this. The science is young and planets are complicated and nature tends to resist simple summaries. But the possibility is there, patient and real, waiting to be understood more deeply. What strikes many researchers when they think carefully about tidally locked worlds is not just what they might lack, it is what they would have instead. On the dark side of such a planet there would be no day, but there would be something else that we rarely think about here, wrapped, as we are, in the cycle of sunrise and sunset. There would be constancy, a kind of unchanging steadiness that our world never quite achieves. Our days end, our nights turn, the temperature shifts, the light shifts, the quality of the air shifts with the seasons. We live in a world of perpetual transition, and much of our biology, our psychology, our sense of time is built around that rhythm. The body expects change, it waits for light, it responds to warmth. On the dark side of a tidally locked world, none of that would exist. There would be no signal from the sky telling living things when to wake, or when to sleep, when to grow, or when to rest, when to expect warmth or prepare for cold. There would simply be the same sky, the same temperature, the same darkness, hour after hour, season after season, century after century. Neuroscientists have observed even in humans what happens when that rhythm disappears. Studies conducted in underground caves where volunteers lived for weeks with no natural light found that the human body does not simply collapse without its daily cues. It continues to run. It keeps its own time quietly internally. A clock that was always there ticking away beneath the surface of everything else, needing no sun to tell it what to do. That internal rhythm, what scientists call the circadian clock, appears to be one of the oldest biological mechanisms in existence. Researchers have found versions of it in nearly every form of life they have studied, from human beings to single-celled organisms so small they cannot be seen without powerful instruments. It seems that life learned very early in the deepest history of this planet how to measure time from the inside, which makes you wonder in the gentlest possible way what a creature evolved entirely without sunrise would use that inner clock for, what it would count, what its sense of time would even mean. There is something quietly humbling about this line of thinking. We spend so much of our lives oriented around the light. Morning is a beginning, evening is a close. The arc of the day gives shape to everything, to meals and meetings, to energy and rest, to the rhythm of attention, and the softening that comes with dark. The sunrise is for most of us one of the most reliable and comforting facts of existence. It comes, it has always come, it will come again. But life, it turns out, does not require that certainty. It suggests something deeper than we usually consider, that the drive to persist, to adapt, to continue, does not come from the light itself. It comes from somewhere inside. Some older, quieter part of the living thing that does not need the sky to tell it to carry on. The planets out there in the dark, turning their cold faces away from their suns forever, are not empty just because no light reaches them. They may be full of questions, full of possibility, full of the kind of patient mystery that only very old, very quiet places hold. And somewhere in that thought, if you let it settle the way the darkness settles now around you, there is something almost reassuring. The dark is not an absence. It is a presence of its own, with its own rules, its own possibilities, its own slow and patient forms of life. And what strange and subtle things grow in that patience that is something we are only beginning very softly to explore. There is a quality to deep cold that is different from ordinary cold. Not the cold of a winter morning when you pull a blanket tighter and wait for the room to warm. Not the pleasant chill of a window left open in autumn. This is something older, something that does not wait. The kind of cold that exists at the far edge of things where warmth has simply never been, and everything arranges itself around that absence, as naturally as water arranges itself around stone. On the dark side of a tidally locked planet, that cold is not a season. It is the condition of everything. And the more planetary scientists study what such a surface might actually be like, the more they find themselves sitting with a landscape that is in its own way breathtaking. Let us think about what heat actually is for a moment in the way that physicists understand it. Heat is not a thing that lives inside objects the way we sometimes imagine it. It is movement. The vibration of particles pressing against one another, passing energy back and forth in constant invisible conversation. When sunlight falls on a surface, it is delivering that energy, speeding up the particles in rock and soil, and water raising their temperature, keeping the conversation going. Without it, the conversation gradually slows. The particles grow quieter. The temperature drops toward what scientists call absolute zero, the point at which movement in theory all but stops. On the sunlit side of a tidally locked planet, that energy arrives continuously uninterrupted for as long as the planet exists. But on the dark side, the delivery never comes. Whatever heat is there arrived long ago, perhaps during the planet's formation, gradually bleeding away into space across geological time. What remains, researchers suggest, would depend entirely on what the atmosphere is doing. If the atmosphere is thin or absent, the dark side would cool without mercy. Some models suggest temperatures could fall to 150 or even 200 degrees below the freezing point of water. The kind of cold where carbon dioxide, which makes up much of the air on worlds like Mars, would precipitate out of the atmosphere and settle on the ground as dry frost. Where nitrogen itself might under certain conditions become a liquid pooling quietly in low places. Where the surface would be carved not by wind or rain or the slow chemistry of living things, but simply by the slow quiet work of extreme cold on rock. It would be, in a word, still. More still than any place on Earth has ever been. And yet something keeps planetary scientists from writing the dark side off entirely. That something is wind. Evidence suggests that on many tidally locked worlds, the atmosphere, if one exists, would be in constant powerful motion. The reason is thermodynamics, that patient branch of physics that governs how energy moves through systems. The sunlit side of a tidally locked planet receives intense, unrelenting heat. The dark side receives none. That difference in temperature creates a difference in pressure. And differences in pressure in any atmosphere produce wind, not gentle breezes, something more like the sustained, enormous atmospheric rivers that planetary scientists find when they model these worlds. great streams of air flowing from the hot side toward the cold, carrying warmth with them across the terminator line, delivering it into the dark in slow, continuous waves, then cooling, sinking, flowing back along the surface toward the light to be warmed again. A circulation pattern as vast and steady as the planet itself. What we understand so far suggests that on some tidally locked worlds, this circulation could be powerful enough to prevent the dark side from freezing completely, that the temperature on the night hemisphere, rather than plunging to the extremes of empty space, might settle somewhere far more moderate. Cold, yes. Quiet, certainly, but not hélas by definition. Not absolutely frozen, just dim and windy and patient. There is something almost meditative about that image. A world where the wind never stops because the temperature difference never resolves because the sun never moves. A circulation that has been running uninterrupted for billions of years. The same air cycling endlessly between the lit and the unlit, carrying warmth into the dark and returning cooling to be warmed again. A breath that never ends. The terminator line itself, that long continuous edge between the permanent day and the permanent night, is the place that draws the most attention from astrobiologists. Not the searing noonside where any water would evaporate and any chemistry would be driven hard by unfiltered radiation. Not the frozen dark, but the edge between them. On Earth we know edges. The place where forest meets meadow holds more species than either one alone. The coastline where ocean meets land is one of the most biologically productive environments on the planet. The zone between deep water and shallow, between light and dark in the ocean, is where much of the sea's chemistry happens. Edges in nature tend to be places of concentration, of activity, of possibility. The terminator of a tidally locked planet would be in some ways the ultimate edge. A line running from pole to pole on both sides of the world where the atmosphere compressed between two extreme zones would be in constant interaction. Where temperatures might be moderate, not too hot, not too cold. Where liquid water, if it existed anywhere on such a world, would have its best chance. Where the winds from both sides would meet and press against each other, and do something complicated and interesting in between. Researchers have found in their models of such worlds that this terminator region could potentially sustain conditions not entirely unlike what we experience on Earth at certain latitudes. Not comfortable by human standards necessarily, but not impossible, not barren by definition. The kind of place where the rules of chemistry and biology might still find room to operate. There is a concept in planetary science called the habitable zone. Most people have heard of it in some form, the region around a star where temperatures could allow liquid water on a planet's surface. Not too hot, not too cold, the right distance, the right amount of warmth. For a long time, scientists imagined this zone in fairly simple terms. A planet in the habitable zone was a good candidate. One outside it was not. But the more researchers study tidally locked planets, the more they find that the question is subtler than that. A tidally locked planet in the habitable zone presents a puzzle. Half of it receives far more than enough heat. The other half receives none. So is it as a planet in the habitable zone? The answer seems to depend less on the average and more on the details on the atmosphere, the composition, the circulation, the presence or absence of oceans, and a dozen other factors that planetary science is still slowly working through. What the brain tends to want when faced with a question like this is a clean answer. Yes or no, habitable or not. But what nature keeps offering instead is something more interesting, a spectrum of possibility, a range of conditions that resist easy sorting. A planet that is too cold in one place and too hot in another, but might have somewhere in between a narrow band of something workable, something alive. It may be that the worlds most worth looking at are not the ones that look most like Earth from a distance, but the ones that surprise us up close. There is something else about the dark side of a tidally locked planet that is rarely discussed but worth sitting with quietly. On Earth, the night sky moves. It rotates slowly overhead, carrying its stars from east to west as the planet turns beneath them. Every constellation rises and sets. The moon crosses the sky over the course of a night. Even the planets drift week by week against the fixed background of distant stars. Nothing in our sky is permanent. Everything, given time, moves on. But on the dark side of a tidally locked world, the sky would be completely perfectly still. The stars would not move. The constellations would hang in exactly the same positions night after night, year after year, for as long as the planet existed. If there were a moon, it might orbit and change, but the stars themselves, the deep background of the universe, would be as fixed as wallpaper, as permanent as stone. It's hard to know exactly what that would mean for any creatures living beneath such a sky. Psychologists often note how deeply the movement of light and sky is woven into human experience, how the arc of the sun organizes not just our bodies, but our sense of narrative, our feeling, that time moves, that things change, that today is different from yesterday, and tomorrow will bring something new. The moving sky is, in a quiet but very deep way, one of the things that makes time feel real. A fixed sky would tell a different story. Time would not be visible in it. The universe would appear from below as something unchanging and permanent, a ceiling rather than a river. Whether that would feel oppressive or reassuring is impossible to say. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Perhaps something else entirely, a relationship to time and to the universe that has no name in our languages, because no creature on Earth has ever lived under a sky that did not move. The dark side, then, is not simply a place without light. It is a place without the particular rhythm that light has always imposed on life here. No sunrise to organize the body's chemistry. No sunset to signal the brain toward rest. No movement in the sky to mark the passage of days, seasons, years. Just the stars fixed. The wind, if there is wind, flowing in from the lit side. The cold patient and deep. And whatever life, if any, has found a way to persist in all of that stillness. What we understand so far suggests that life is more flexible than it might seem from where we sit. It finds edges. It uses whatever energy is available. It keeps time from the inside when the outside offers nothing to count. It settles into conditions that once seemed impossible, and given long enough begins to treat them as ordinary. There are still quiet questions around what the dark side of a tidally locked world would truly be like. The models are improving year by year as telescopes grow more powerful and the science of planetary atmospheres deepens. And the answers, when they finally arrive, will almost certainly be stranger and more interesting than any model as yet captured. But for now, in the dark and the quiet of this particular night, it is enough just to let the image settle. A planet out there somewhere with one face turned always to its sun and the other face turned always away. Stars fixed overhead, cold wind moving across a silent surface, the long edge of the Terminator glowing somewhere in the permanent distance like the memory of a sunset that happened once and never ended. And somewhere near that edge, perhaps in the narrow margin between too much and too little, something is still. Something is waiting. Something, it may be, is listening to the wind. That edge, that patient permanent border between the light and the dark, is where the next part of this story quietly lives. Because what happens there when the atmosphere carries the first threads of warmth into the perpetual cold turns out to be more remarkable than anyone first imagined. There is a small experiment that almost anyone can do. Take a plant, any plant one you might have near a window, and move it into a completely dark room. Not dim, not shadowed, completely dark with no light reaching it at any hour of the day or night. And then watch over the days that follow what happens. The plant does not simply stop. It continues for a while to behave as though the light were still there. At roughly the same time each day its leaves will orient themselves as if turning toward a sun that no longer comes. Its stomata, the tiny pores on the surface of its leaves through which it breathes, will open in the morning hours and close toward an evening on a schedule that exists nowhere in the room around it. The rhythm persists. The expectation persists. The plant keeps time in the dark from the inside because it has always known how. This is one of the quieter revelations in all of plant biology. Plants have what researchers describe as a circadian clock, an internal timekeeping system that runs on a roughly 24-hour cycle, regardless of whether light is available to confirm it. The word circadian comes from the Latin for around a day, and it was chosen carefully because the clock does not run on exactly 24 hours without external input. It runs on approximately that. It drifts slightly when left on its own, a few minutes here, a few minutes there. But when light returns, the clock resets itself. It synchronizes. It uses the information from its environment to correct the small errors that accumulate in the dark. Scientists describe this as entrainment, the process by which an internal rhythm locks onto an external one. And what makes it remarkable is not just that it exists in plants, but that it exists in almost every living thing scientists have studied carefully enough to look. Bacteria, fungi, insects, fish. Every branch of the tree of life, no matter how distant from every other, seems to have found the same quiet solution to the same ancient problem: how to prepare for what is coming rather than simply reacting to what is already here. The plant that opens its stomata before the sun rises is not responding to the light. It is anticipating it. It has in some sense learned the pattern of the world deeply enough to predict it. And that prediction, that internal model of the day, is one of the most fundamental things life has ever done. Now imagine a plant on a world where the light never comes. Not a world in total darkness, not yet, but a world where there is no rhythm to the light, where the light, if it exists at all, arrives without pattern, without cycle, without the regular pulse of day and night that life on Earth has been tuned to for billions of years. What would that do to the clock? Studies conducted in laboratory conditions have given scientists some insight into this question. When organisms are kept in constant light or constant darkness, or under artificial light cycles that do not match the natural day, their internal clocks continue to run, but they drift. They gradually fall out of alignment with the world around them, each organism running on its own private schedule, accumulating small errors that are never corrected. In plants, this leads to disrupted growth, reduced photosynthesis, and a kind of inefficiency that compounds over time as the plant invests energy in the wrong preparations at the wrong moments. In a world without any light cycle, it seems that the circadian clock would eventually become more liability than tool, a mechanism designed to anticipate a pattern that does not exist, running quietly and faithfully in the background, waiting for a signal that will never arrive to reset it. What happens to life when its most ancient rhythm loses its anchor? The answer, in some form, has already played out here on Earth, not on a planetary scale, but in the deep, lightless places where life has always quietly persisted long before we knew to look for it. The ocean floor is one of those places. Below the depth that sunlight can reach, roughly 200 meters in clear water, less in turbid water, there is no light. None. The photons from the surface do not make it down. The chemistry of photosynthesis, which requires light energy to split water molecules and build sugars, cannot happen there, and yet life has been present on the ocean floor for an almost incomprehensible span of time. It did not wait for the light to arrive. It built its own economy from completely different raw materials. The first hint of how radical that economy could be came in the late 1970s when researchers aboard a deep-sea submersible descended to the floor of the Pacific Ocean near the Galapagos Islands. What they found there, what no one had expected to find, was an entire ecosystem, clustered around cracks in the ocean floor where superheated water rich in chemicals was venting up from the Earth's interior. Not a sparse scattering of microbes, a dense, complex, thriving community of life. Tube worms 2 meters long, clams the size of dinner plates, shrimp, crabs, fish, and at the base of all of it, bacteria doing something that at the time barely fit into the established framework of how life was understood to work. Those bacteria were not using sunlight to build energy, they were using chemical reactions. Specifically, they were oxidizing hydrogen sulfide, a compound that seeps out of the vents along with the hot water, and using the energy released by that reaction to fix carbon dioxide into organic molecules. The same basic outcome as photosynthesis achieved through an entirely different mechanism. No light required. Scientists now call this process chemosynthesis, and in the decades since that first discovery, it has been found in an extraordinary range of environments. Not just hydrothermal vents in the deep Pacific, but cold seeps where methane bubbles slowly from the seafloor, beneath Antarctic ice, in volcanic springs, in the rock itself kilometers below the surface where bacteria live on the energy released by the slow oxidation of minerals. Life, it turns out, is not a photosynthesis story. Photosynthesis is one strategy among several, a very successful one clearly, but not the only one. And not the only one that could in principle support an ecosystem on a world where no sun ever rises. Evidence suggests that on a tidally locked planet, the dark side might have its own sources of chemical energy, not from vents necessarily, but from the geological activity of the planet itself, from radiation interacting with ice, from the slow work of chemistry between rock and water in the absence of light. These would be quieter, less energetic processes than the rich vents of the deep Pacific, but they would be processes nonetheless. Gradients of energy waiting to be exploited by anything that's enough and small enough to use them. What we understand so far suggests that the minimum requirement for life, at least for life as we have found it here, is not light. It is not even warmth exactly. It is a gradient, a difference. A place where energy can flow from one state to another, releasing something in the process that a small clever piece of chemistry can capture and use. Sunlight creates gradients on the surface of our planet temperature, differences, chemical differences, the energized state of molecules struck by photons. But gradients can arise in other ways. They arise wherever the planet is active, wherever chemistry is happening, wherever the universe has not yet finished settling into equilibrium, and the universe, it seems, is very rarely finished settling. There is another dimension to this question that plant biology raises quietly from a slightly different angle. Plants do not just need light for energy, they need it for information. The length of the day, the photoperiod in the language of botanists, tells many plants when to flower, when to form seeds, when to prepare for winter, and when to expect spring. This process is called photoperiodism, and it is how a tulip knows to bloom in April rather than November, how a chrysanthemum knows to flower in autumn, how a soybean plant times the development of its pods to the lengthening of summer. The mechanism involves a family of light-sensitive proteins called phytochromes, which exist in two interconvertible forms. One form absorbs red light and converts to the other. The second form slowly converts back to the first in the dark. By measuring the ratio of the two forms, the plant effectively measures the length of the night, not the day, interestingly, but the dark period. That is the actual signal, the uninterrupted dark. On a world with no day-night cycle, this system would receive no useful information. The night would be endless. The ratio of the two forms of the protein would settle and stay settled, never switching, never signaling. The timing of reproduction, one of the most fundamental activities in any living thing's life, would lose its environmental cue entirely. What would life do with that? It may be that reproduction on a dark world would be governed not by season, not by light, but by something internal, some other rhythm, some other signal, some aspect of the organism's chemistry that tracks not the turning of a planet, but the slower cycles of the world beneath its feet. Temperature, chemical availability, the timing of geological events, it is impossible to know from here. But it is not impossible to wonder quietly that life would find a way, because that is the pattern that keeps emerging the more deeply scientists look. Life does not wait for ideal conditions. It moves toward whatever gradient is available. It modifies its behavior to use what exists rather than what it needs. It keeps time from the inside when the outside goes quiet. It finds the edge, the vent, the crack, the slow seep of chemistry in the dark, and it builds something there patient and small and persistent. The plants outside your window know this in their own way. Every autumn when the days shorten and the night grows long, the phytochromes in their leaves measure the dark and send their signal. Every spring when the light returns, the clock resets and the preparation for growth begins again on time, as it has been on time since the first ancestor of that plant learned to listen to the world. That listening is very old. Older than flowers, older than roots, older perhaps than anything that looks like a plant at all. And what scientists have quietly observed in the deepest and most lightless corners of this planet is that even when the listening has no signal to respond to something in the living world, continues to wait, patiently, steadily, as though it has learned over enough time that the signal always comes eventually, even if on some worlds it does not. And what scientists discovered next in the darkest places they have ever thought to look is something the body has always known, long before anyone thought to ask the question. There is a place not far from where the tectonic plates of the Pacific Ocean slowly pull apart from one another, where the sea floor opens and breathes. Not literally, of course, but the image is not far off. From cracks in the ocean floor, superheated water rises in dark plumes, carrying with it minerals dissolved from deep within the Earth's crust. Sulfur compounds iron, manganese, hydrogen, silica. The water can reach temperatures of 300 degrees Celsius or more, though it does not boil held in liquid form by the immense pressure of the ocean above it. It billows upward in dark clouds, and the effect in the lights of a deep-sea submersible looks genuinely like something breathing. Around these vents in water so cold and under pressure, so crushing that no human could survive, their unprotected life has built one of the most complete and self-sustaining ecosystems on Earth. And it has done so entirely without the sun. When researchers first descended to the hydrothermal vents near the Galapagos Rift in the late 1970s, they were not expecting to find much. The deep ocean was understood at the time to be a kind of biological desert, sparse cold dependent on the slow rain of organic material drifting down from the sunlit surface far above. What they found instead overturned a fundamental assumption about what life requires. The vent communities were dense, not scattered. Dense in the way a forest is dense with organisms layered and packed and filling every available space. Giant tube worms in clusters so thick they look like fields of pale grass. Mussels and clams wedged into crevices. Ghostly white crabs picking their way across surfaces filmed with microbial mats. Shrimp in their thousands clustering near the vent openings, navigating the gradient between scalding and merely cold. At the base of all of it, the foundation, the thing that made the rest possible, were bacteria. And these bacteria were doing something that required an entirely new framework to understand. They were eating rock chemistry, or more precisely, they were using the energy released by chemical reactions between the vent fluids and the surrounding seawater to drive biological processes. Specifically, they oxidized hydrogen sulfide, a compound that most life on Earth treats as a toxin, and used the energy from that oxidation to fix carbon dioxide into organic compounds. To build, in other words, the raw material that everything else in the ecosystem would eventually eat. Researchers found this so unexpected that it took some time for the full implications to settle. Life was not, after all, a phenomenon that depended on the sun. It was a phenomenon that depended on energy gradients. And energy gradients, it turned out, could come from chemistry as readily as from light. The tube worms that live at these vents have developed one of the more remarkable physiological solutions in the animal kingdom. They have no mouth, no digestive tract, no way to eat in any conventional sense. Instead, their bodies contain a specialized organ called a trophosome, packed with billions of chemosynthetic bacteria. The worm and the bacteria live in a relationship of deep mutual dependence. The worm absorbs hydrogen sulfide and oxygen from the water through a plume of tissue at its tip, delivers these compounds to the bacteria within its body, and the bacteria convert them into organic molecules that feed the worm. The worm, in turn, provides the bacteria with a stable, protected environment and a reliable supply of the compounds they need. It seems that this arrangement, the complete internalization of an energy source, the folding of an entire metabolism inside another organism's body, is one of the more elegant solutions life has found to the problem of living somewhere difficult. What researchers have found looking carefully at these symbiotic relationships is that they are not rare anomalies. Similar arrangements appear at cold seeps where methane rather than hydrogen sulfide provides the chemical gradient, in the gills of mussels living near hydrocarbon vents, in the cells of certain clams that live in oxygen-poor sediments. Each time the same basic architecture an animal that has through evolution essentially built its own power plant. A living thing that carries its energy source with it because the environment cannot be trusted to provide a consistent one. On a world without sunlight, that kind of internalized solution might be the dominant pattern of life rather than the exception. Rather than depending on a surface chemistry driven by photons, life might develop primarily as a network of chemical partnerships, each organism hosting or exchanging with others, sharing gradients, passing energy from one form to another in long quiet chains that never need to reach toward the sky. There are ecosystems on Earth that hint at what this might look like at larger scales. Deep beneath the surface of South Africa, in gold mines extending several kilometers into the crust, microbiologists have found communities of bacteria living in water that has been isolated from the surface for millions of years, not thousands, millions. These organisms have no connection to the sunlit world above them. They do not depend even indirectly on photosynthesis. Their energy comes from the radiolysis of water, a process in which radiation emitted by naturally occurring radioactive minerals in the surrounding rock splits water molecules producing hydrogen that the bacteria can use. Evidence suggests that life has been persisting down there in those dark, pressurized ancient waters for longer than modern humans have existed. Living on radiation and rock chemistry, reproducing, slowly metabolizing, slowly existing at a pace so unhurried that a single cell division might take decades. It is a kind of life so different from anything visible at the surface that it almost requires a different vocabulary to describe. Not fast, not competitive in any obvious way, not oriented toward growth or expansion or the exploitation of seasonal abundance, just persistent, steady, patient in a way that spans geological time. It may be that on a dark planet, life of this kind, slow, deep, chemically powered, indifferent to the sky, would be the norm rather than a curiosity. That what we think of as life, with its urgency and its surfaces and its dependence on the sun, is actually a specialized variant, a response to the particular conditions of this particular planet. And that the deeper, quieter form of it, the kind that lives on heat and chemistry in the dark, is closer to what life looks like across most of the universe. Astrobiologists have a term for the conditions necessary to support life of this kind. They speak of the subsurface habitable zone, not the region around a star where surface temperatures could support liquid water, but the region within a planet itself, where geological heat pressure and chemistry could sustain liquid water and energy gradients regardless of what the surface looks like. This zone researchers have found is potentially much larger than the surface habitable zone. It extends deep into planetary interiors wherever the heat from radioactive decay and residual formation energy keeps temperatures above freezing. On Earth, this zone extends several kilometers down. On other worlds, particularly larger, more geologically active worlds, it could extend much deeper. What this means in quiet but significant terms is that the search for life in the universe should not be limited to looking at surfaces. It should include looking inward, into the rock, into the deep water, into the places where the sun has never reached and never will, but where the slow chemistry of a planet's interior is still patiently providing the gradients that life requires. Mars, which appears cold and barren at its surface, may have a subsurface that is warmer, wetter, and more chemically active than anything visible from orbit. Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, has an ocean of liquid water beneath a crust of ice kept liquid by tidal heating from Jupiter's gravity. Enceladus, a small moon of Saturn, vents water vapor and organic compounds from beneath its surface into space, suggesting a liquid ocean below that is in contact with a rocky seafloor. These are not distant hypothetical worlds. They are members of our own solar system, and the mind quietly registers what that implies that life might be common, not because stars are surrounded by warm sunlit worlds, but because the interiors of cold, dark, icy bodies are riddled with the conditions that life already knows how to use. There is something gently humbling about all of this. We imagine life as a sunward thing, as something that reaches upward toward light and warmth, stretching and growing and photosynthesizing. And much of life here does exactly that. But beneath that visible story in the deepest cracks and coldest waters and darkest rock, a different kind of life had been running quietly, continuously for an enormous span of time. It does not reach toward the sun. It does not measure the day. It does not care whether the sky is light or dark. It simply finds the gradient and uses it. That kind of persistence, unhurried, unspectacular, indifferent to the surface drama of weather and seasons and light, is in some ways the more fundamental story. The story of what life does when stripped of everything except the bare minimum. And the bare minimum, it turns out, is not very much at all. Just energy. Just chemistry. Just a small difference between one state and another, maintained long enough for something small and clever to notice and begin. Scientists are still exploring exactly how widespread chemosynthetic ecosystems might be both on Earth and elsewhere. The deep biosphere, as researchers have come to call the collective community of organisms living beneath the surface in rock and sediment and isolated water, may contain a mass of living material comparable to, or even exceeding everything living on the surface. The numbers are uncertain and contested, but the direction they point is clear enough. The surface is not where most of life's story happens. It may simply be where most of our story happens, and somewhere in the dark, in the rock, in the slow chemistry of a planet that has long since turned its face away from its sun, something small is doing what life has always done, finding a way, moving toward whatever is available, persisting without urgency, without drama, without any need at all for the light. The warmth in the dark has always been enough. What that patience teaches and what the body carries of it, even here, even now, that question drifts into the next quiet layer of this story like heat moving slowly through stone. Somewhere in the limestone hills of central Texas there is a river that disappears underground. It does not end. It simply descends, flowing into a crack in the rock, threading through passages that have no name, moving through a world of complete and permanent darkness, until it eventually resurfaces somewhere else miles away as if nothing had happened. And in the water moving through those lightless tunnels are fish. Not dead fish, not dying fish, living, active, feeding, reproducing fish, a species called the Mexican blind cave fish, which has spent so long in the dark that its eyes have not merely stopped working, They have over many generations stopped developing at all. Where eyes once grew, there is now only smooth skin. The sockets are absent. The visual cortex, that region of the brain dedicated to processing what the eyes see, has been redirected toward other purposes. The fish does not miss what it has never had. And it navigates, feeds, finds mates, and avoids obstacles in complete darkness as efficiently as any surface fish does in full light. The question of how animals orient themselves without light is one that researchers have returned to again and again, because the answers keep arriving from unexpected directions. The cavefish uses a system called the lateral line, a row of pressure-sensitive cells running along each side of its body, extending across its head in a pattern of fine canals. This system detects minute changes in water pressure and flow, allowing the fish to build a three-dimensional picture of its environment from disturbances in the water rather than from light. When the fish swims near a wall, the water it displaces rebounds and returns to it, and the lateral line reads that return as information. The fish effectively sees by the shape of the water around it. What researchers have found in studying this system is that the lateral line of cave-adapted fish is not merely functional, it is enhanced. The number of pressure-sensitive organs is greater in cave populations than in their surface-dwelling relatives. The brain regions that process that information are larger. What was once a supplementary system useful but secondary to vision has become the primary means of understanding the world. The nervous system, given enough time and enough generations, reorganized itself around what was actually available. This is what biologists call sensory compensation, and it appears across the animal kingdom in animals that live in low-light or no-light environments with a consistency that is in its own way quietly remarkable. Cave salamanders develop chemosensory systems of extraordinary sensitivity, able to detect the chemical signatures of prey organisms in water at concentrations vanishingly small. Their sense of smell, extended and refined, gives them a map of the cave that is as detailed and reliable as anything a sighted animal gets from its eyes. Some cave shrimp have developed sensory hairs so fine that they can detect the slight vibrations made by a falling water droplet from several body lengths away. And bats which are not cave exclusive but which spend much of their lives in complete darkness have evolved a system of biological sonar so precise that it can detect an object the width of a human hair in total darkness while flying at speed. The calls they emit, far above the range of human hearing, bounce off the surfaces and return as echoes, and the bat's brain processes those echoes into a spatial model of extraordinary resolution. Studies indicate that the auditory cortex of an echolocating bat occupies a far larger proportion of the brain than in comparable mammals that rely on vision. The brain has traded territory for information, reallocating neural resources to the sense that actually works in the dark. There is something in this that feels worth sitting with for a moment. Not as a lesson, but as an observation. The brain in these animals did not fail when the light disappeared. It adapted. It found the information that was available and built new machinery to process it quietly over generations without drama or crisis. It simply reorganized toward what was there. But navigation in darkness is not only about sensing the immediate environment, it also involves knowing where you are in a larger space. And this turns out to require a different set of tools entirely. Many animals that live in darkness or that migrate at night or that spend time underground use the Earth's magnetic field to orient themselves. This ability, called magnetoreception, has been documented in a range of species so diverse that researchers are still working out whether it arose once in evolutionary history or many times independently. Migratory birds, sea turtles, certain fish, honeybees, fruit flies, even some bacteria which produce tiny crystals of a magnetic mineral called magnetite inside their cells, apparently using these crystals to orient themselves relative to the Earth's magnetic field lines. How the magnetic sense works in most of these animals is still a matter of active investigation. There are two leading candidates. One involves those same magnetite crystals, which in some animals appear to be embedded in sensory cells that could detect the pull of the magnetic field mechanically like a tiny compass needle. The other involves a photochemical reaction in a protein called cryptochrome, found in the eyes and possibly other tissues of many animals, which appears to be sensitive to magnetic fields in a way that creates a kind of visual signal, a faint overlay on the animal's field of view invisible to us, but potentially meaningful to them. It may be that some animals quite literally see the magnetic field of the Earth as a pattern of light and shadow or of subtle colour superimposed on their ordinary vision. A second layer of information about the world, quiet and constant, that most of us have no access to and no awareness of running beneath the one we can see. What this suggests in practical terms is that an animal living on the dark side of a tidally locked world would not be navigationally helpless simply because there is no sun to navigate by. On Earth, the sun is useful for navigation in a particular way. It provides a consistent directional reference, a bright point that moves predictably across the sky that animals can use to maintain compass bearings and calibrate their internal sense of direction. But it is not the only reference available. The magnetic field of a planet does not require a sun. It is generated by the churning of the planet's interior, by the motion of conductive material deep within the core, and it extends out into space entirely independently of whether the planet is lit from outside or not. A tidally locked planet with an active interior would likely have a magnetic field. An animal living on its dark side would have access to that field. And if evolution had enough time to work, and on planets circling red dwarf stars which can burn steadily for tens of billions of years, time is something available in astonishing abundance. The animals there might develop sensory systems oriented around magnetism the way ours are oriented around light, perceiving direction as a felt quality of the world, moving through the dark as confidently as a migratory bird moves through a moonless night over an ocean it has never seen before. There is also the question of time. Without a sun, without day and night, without the circadian cues that most of Earth's animals depend on, how would a creature in the dark know when to do what? Researchers have explored this question partly through studies of animals in caves, which provide a natural laboratory for exactly this problem. Cave-adapted animals show a range of responses. Some retain a functional circadian clock running on the same approximate 24-hour period as their surface relatives, even though no light reaches them to reset it. Others have lost the clock almost entirely, their activity patterns no longer tied to any regular cycle driven, instead by local cues, the presence of food, the chemical signals of other individuals, the subtle movements of water. What we understand so far suggests that the circadian clock is not something the body gives up easily. It seems to persist quietly even in darkness, even when it is no longer calibrated to anything external. Perhaps because the cost of maintaining it is small compared to the cost of rebuilding it if conditions change. Perhaps because the rhythms it drives in immune function, in cellular repair, in hormone release are valuable regardless of whether the external world has a day-night cycle. Or perhaps for a reason more fundamental still, that the rhythm itself, independent of what it tracks, is somehow useful, that the body cycling through states moving between modes of activity and rest functions better for the oscillation than it would in any steady state. The mind quietly registers something familiar in that. The value of rhythm, of alternation, of not doing the same thing continuously but moving between states, resting and waking, spending and replenishing. Even in the dark, even with no sun to follow, the body keeps that wisdom. Psychologists often note that human beings, when deprived of all external time cues, do not simply drift into continuous, undifferentiated wakefulness. They sleep, they wake, they impose a cycle on an environment that provides none. The internal clock, freed from its usual anchors, runs slightly long, closer to 25 hours than 24, and the person drifts gradually out of alignment with the external world. But the rhythm itself persists because it comes from somewhere older than the environment, somewhere inside the biology itself, wound in like a spring. Animals that have lived in caves for millions of years carry different versions of this story. Some have lost the visible mechanisms of the clock but retained its outputs. The cycle of activity and rest continues even when the molecular machinery that usually drives it has been reduced or simplified. Some seem to have transferred the entraining role from light to something else. Temperature fluctuations in cave water, chemical changes in the food supply, the presence of other members of their species. The clock finds a new anchor quieter than the sun, but enough. Evidence suggests that life is extraordinarily reluctant to give up its rhythms even when the thing the rhythms were built to track has disappeared. The cycle outlasts its cause. And in that persistence, that quiet refusal of the body to go entirely still, there is something that connects the cave fish with the migrating bird, with bacterium orienting itself by magnetic crystals in the sediment, and perhaps with whatever might one day be found moving through the deep windswept darkness of a planet that lost its sunrise a long time ago. They all know something about navigating without the obvious. Something about finding direction in the absence of light and keeping time in the absence of a clock and moving forward through a world that does not announce its structure. It is a kind of knowledge that does not need words. It is older than words. It lives in the cells, in the small magnetic crystals, in the pressure-sensing hairs, in the rhythm of the breath slowing now in a dark and quiet room. And somewhere in the space between one breath and the next there is another layer, to this one that the atmosphere itself has been carrying all along, quietly from the lit side of the world into the dark. Think for a moment about the feeling of warm air moving through a cold room, not the blast of a heater, something gentler. The slow drift of warmth from one side of a space to another, carried by currents you cannot see arriving quietly at the place where you are sitting, softening the temperature around you without announcing itself. You feel it before you understand it. The air is simply less cold than it was a moment ago, and then a little less cold still, and gradually the room changes from the inside out without anything being switched on or adjusted, simply because the heat is moving, the way heat always moves from where there is more of it toward where there is less. On a tidally locked planet, this principle governs everything, not just the comfort of a room, the fate of an entire hemisphere. Atmospheric circulation is one of the foundational processes of planetary science, a field that has grown enormously in the last few decades as better telescopes, better computers, and better mathematical models have allowed researchers to study the climates of worlds beyond our own with increasing detail. On Earth, atmospheric circulation is driven primarily by the difference in solar heating between the equator and the poles. The equator receives more direct sunlight, heats the air above it, and that warm air rises, spreads toward the poles, cools, sinks, and returns along the surface. The result is a complex layered system of circulation patterns, the trade winds, the jet streams, the great overturning circulations of the ocean, all ultimately powered by that single difference in solar input. On a tidally locked planet, the geometry of the heating difference is more extreme by far. Rather than a contrast between equator and poles, there is a contrast between an entire hemisphere in perpetual noon and an entire hemisphere in perpetual midnight. The temperature difference between these two sides can in some models reach several hundred degrees Celsius. The atmospheric response to that difference is correspondingly dramatic. Researchers have found through increasingly sophisticated climate modelling of tidally locked worlds that the dominant feature of such a planet's atmosphere would be a powerful planet-spanning overturning circulation. Warm air heated on the day side rises in an enormous column above the substellar point, the spot directly beneath the star, the planet's permanent noon. That air then flows outward at high altitude across the entire planet in all directions toward the night side. It cools as it moves into the dark, descends on the night hemisphere, and flows back along the surface toward the day side where it is heated and rises again. The result is a circulation system unlike anything on Earth. Not a set of latitude-banded belts and jets, but something closer to a single global cell driven by one hot spot and one cold sink, flowing with remarkable persistence in the same direction along the same paths across geological time. What this circulation does to the dark side is, in the most practical terms, the difference between a frozen wasteland and something else entirely. Without that heat transport, the night hemisphere of a tidally locked planet would cool without limit. Given enough time, all volatiles, water, carbon dioxide, nitrogen would freeze out of the atmosphere and settle on the cold surface, and the atmosphere itself might collapse, thinning to almost nothing as its constituent gases became ice. The dark side would become a trap for atmospheric material, slowly pulling the planet's air down into solid form, leaving the day side exposed to the star without any atmospheric protection. This is not merely a theoretical concern. Scientists are still exploring the threshold conditions under which this atmospheric collapse might actually happen, and the answer depends on a complex interplay of the planet's atmospheric composition, its rotation, its distance from its star and other factors. But it remains one of the central uncertainties in the study of tidally locked habitable worlds, the question of whether the atmosphere can move heat fast enough to prevent its own destruction. What we understand so far suggests that for rocky planets with substantial atmospheres, particularly those containing water vapor and carbon dioxide, which are good at trapping and transporting thermal energy, the circulation is likely to be strong enough to prevent collapse. The heat transport keeps the dark side above the freezing point of whatever the dominant volatile is. The atmosphere remains in gas phase and the circulation continues. A self-sustaining system kept in motion by the permanent contrast it is simultaneously working to reduce. It may be one of the more elegant feedback loops in planetary science, a process that can only exist because of an imbalance. And that persists precisely because it can never fully resolve that imbalance, because the star keeps shining on one side and the other side keeps facing away. The terminator region, that long continuous line where the perpetual day meets the perpetual night, sits at the convergence of these circulation patterns in a way that makes it physically one of the most active and interesting places on such a world. On the day side of the terminator, the circulation is pushing outward, carrying heat from the scorching substellar region across the planet's face. On the night side, the surface return flow is moving in from the dark, cold and dense, sliding along the ground toward the warmth. Where these two meet at the terminator, the dynamics are complex and variable in ways that climate models are still working through. Evidence suggests that the terminator region might be persistently cloudy, as the warm, moisture-laden air flowing out from the day side meets the cold return flow. From the night side, it cools rapidly and any water vapor it carries condenses. The result might be a more or less permanent band of cloud cover along the terminator wrapping around the entire planet from pole to pole, a ring of cloud and weather in the otherwise relatively stable circulation system. Those clouds would do several things simultaneously. They would reflect some incoming starlight, reducing the heating on the day side. They would trap thermal radiation acting as a blanket over the night side. They would produce precipitation rain or snow depending on temperature, creating a water cycle concentrated along the terminator rather than distributed across the planet the way it is on Earth. And they would provide liquid water in a relatively temperate zone, which is, as astrobiologists note with quiet interest, one of the more essential ingredients for the kind of chemistry that leads to life. The image that emerges from all of this modelling is of a planet with a distinct geography of climate zones, a blazing, dry, radiation-scoured day side, a frozen, wind-swept, chemically quiet night side, and between them a continuous ring of temperate, cloudy, wet, dynamically active conditions following the terminator around the planet like a permanent weather front that never moves and never quite resolves. Planetary scientists have a phrase for the most favourable region of this ring, the terminator habitable zone. It is not a zone defined by distance from a star the way the conventional habitable zone is. It is a zone defined by atmospheric dynamics, by the specific conditions that arise at the interface of two extreme environments. And it has, in the thinking of some researchers, important advantages over a more uniformly temperate world. The terminator zone would have reliable liquid water, moderate temperatures held relatively stable by the clouds and the circulation patterns, protection from the most intense stellar radiation by those same clouds and by the geometry of the planet's orientation, and a constant supply of chemical energy flowing in on the warm air from the day side, not just heat but chemistry. Reactive compounds produced on the irradiated day side transported into a zone where the temperatures allow them to participate in more complex reactions. Studies indicate that interesting chemistry tends to happen at interfaces where two different environments meet and their contents mix. The terminator of a tidally locked planet is in a sense the ultimate interface. Not just two temperatures meeting or two air masses, but two entire hemispheres each, with its own distinct chemistry, geology and energy regime pressing against each other across a continuous line that spans the entire circumference of the world. It is worth pausing here in the middle of all this atmospheric science to notice what the wind is actually doing. It is carrying warmth from a place of abundance across the darkness toward a place of cold. It does not do this because it has decided to be generous. It does it because that is what heat does, move from where there is more of it toward where there is less, following a gradient filling. What is empty, softening. What is extreme. The physics requires it. The atmosphere obeys. And in the obedience of the atmosphere and the blind, patient, necessary movement of warm air across a dark hemisphere, there is something that keeps a planet alive that would otherwise freeze and fall silent. Not intention, not care, just the ordinary behaviour of matter following its own nature, and in doing so creating conditions that life can use. The brain tends to find meaning in such patterns. Or perhaps it simply recognizes them the way it recognizes anything that has always been true. Warmth moving toward cold, abundance flowing toward scarcity. The wind that does not know it is doing anything at all, and in not knowing does everything. There is something else the circulation does that researchers have only recently begun to study carefully. As warm air flows from the day side across the terminator and into the night side, it carries not just heat but particles, fine dust lifted from the dry irradiated dayside surface. Organic compounds, if any exist, formed in the energetic chemistry of the substellar region. Water molecules, salt crystals if there are oceans. These particles become the nuclei around which cloud droplets form the seeds of precipitation, the raw material for whatever surface chemistry might occur on the night side. The circulation, in other words, is not just a heat transport system. It is a material transport system. It moves the products of one environment into another, mixing the chemistry of the two hemispheres across the terminator in a continuous exchange that has no parallel on Earth. What we understand so far suggests that this exchange could be crucial for any chemistry that might eventually lead to biology. On Earth, life did not arise in a single isolated environment. It arose, most researchers believe, at interfaces where chemistry from different environments mixed, where energy gradients were sharpest, where materials accumulated. The terminator of a tidally locked planet provides exactly those conditions supplied continuously by the winds. The wind crosses the line between the lit and the unlit, carrying everything the light has made into the keeping of the dark. And in the dark, patiently, the chemistry continues, There is a quieter layer to this one that most researchers only began to consider in the last few years. What happens not in the air above the terminator, but in the rock and water below it, where the wind's gifts finally settle and something still and patient begins to work with what it has been given. There is a particular quality of darkness that only exists in places far from any city. If you have ever stood in a field or on a mountain or beside an ocean on a night when the moon was absent and the clouds had cleared entirely, you will know what that darkness is. It is not empty. It is full of a faint, diffuse luminosity that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A glow so soft it is almost not there, and yet present enough that you can see the shape of your hand against it. The sky is not black in those places. It is deep blue or faintly silver, lit from within by the accumulated light of hundreds of billions of stars too far away to resolve individually their light pooled together into a quiet wash that astronomers call the diffuse galactic background. This is what a sky without a nearby star would actually look like. Not perfectly dark, not the absolute blackness of deep space. Something softer and stranger than that. A perpetual, sourceless luminescence spread evenly across the whole of the visible universe. On the dark side of a tidally locked planet, this is the closest thing to daylight that the sky would ever offer. The physics of light in the absence of a dominant local source is something that researchers have studied carefully, both for the practical purposes of telescope design and for the more philosophical question of what the experience of different kinds of night would be like. On Earth, our nights are complicated. The moon contributes significantly to sky brightness when it is present. A full moon illuminates the landscape brightly enough to cast shadows to read by, in clear conditions to navigate over unfamiliar terrain. Even a crescent moon changes the quality of the dark. When the moon is absent, starlight alone provides a faint but measurable illumination of roughly 1/10,000th the brightness of full daylight. Not nothing, not enough to read by, but enough that the human eye, fully adapted to darkness, can detect shapes and movement and the coarse texture of the world. The tidally locked planet's dark side would have all of this starlight, the diffuse galactic background, whatever light might be reflected from a moon if the planet had one, but it would lack the single most significant contributor to nighttime brightness on Earth. When the sun is below the horizon, the glow of the planet's own illuminated side reflected back into the atmosphere. Here on Earth, that reflected light called Earthshine, when we see it bouncing back from the moon, is a significant source of nighttime illumination near twilight. The sky is never fully dark at the horizon, even on a moonless night, because the sunlit portion of the atmosphere nearby scatters some of that light upward. On the dark side of a tidally locked world, the sunlit side is always on the opposite hemisphere, and the planet itself would block that light entirely. The night sky near the surface of the dark side would be as dark as the deepest hours of a moonless night here, that quiet, sourceless, star-filled dark all the time. But the star itself would still be there, visible. This is something that is easy to overlook in imagining the dark side of a tidally locked planet. The star does not disappear. From the dark hemisphere, the star that the planet orbits would be simply below the horizon on the far side of the world, just as our sun is below the horizon during our night. And just as our sun illuminates the sky above the horizon, even when it has set that long, soft twilight that persists for half an hour after sunset, the star of a tidally locked planet would illuminate the atmospheric layers near the terminator, and some of that light would be scattered around the limb of the planet into the dark side sky. Scientists suggest that the degree of this twilight scatter would depend on the thickness and composition of the planet's atmosphere. On a world with a dense scattering atmosphere, the terminator regions might have a persistent glow at the horizon, not a sunrise, not approaching, not receding, but simply they're always at exactly the same point in the sky in exactly the same direction, unchanging. A permanent distant blush of illumination at one edge of the world. The nearest regions of the dark side to the Terminator might live in a state of perpetual deep twilight rather than complete darkness. Not enough light to drive photosynthesis, not enough to warm the surface significantly, but enough to give the sky a faint gradient, a sense of direction, a horizon that glows. And overhead in the part of the dark side sky, furthest from the Terminator, the stars would be extraordinary. There is a reason that human beings throughout history have built their deepest astronomy at altitude and in desert regions far from coasts and cities. The atmosphere degrades the view of the stars, moisture scatters light, atmospheric turbulence blurs the images. Even on the clearest nights in the most remote locations on Earth, we see the stars through a layer of gas that is never entirely still, never entirely transparent, always adding a small amount of its own noise to the signal. But the quality of viewing also depends on what else is in the sky, competing with that signal. On Earth, the moon washes out fainter stars for a large part of every month. Light pollution from human settlements affects vast areas of the planet. Even the natural airglow of Earth's own atmosphere, a faint chemiluminescence produced by chemical reactions in the upper atmosphere visible in long-exposure photographs, as a diffuse green shimmer adds a small constant background that limits how faint an object can be seen. On the dark side of a tidally locked planet with no star rising and no moon to speak of and a much simpler airglow chemistry, the view of the night sky would be essentially uncompromised. Every star visible from the planet's surface would be visible all the time at the same position, never moving, never washed out by a brighter source. The faintest galaxies, the most diffuse nebulae, the subtlest structures in the Milky Way, all of them available always to whatever eyes might exist there to see them. It may be that the dark side of a tidally locked planet is the finest natural observatory in any solar system. A world with nothing to look at locally and therefore nothing to interfere with looking far. This raises a question that is both practical and in its own way quietly wonderful. What would vision look like on such a world? Eyes are not general-purpose instruments. They are solutions to specific problems. Human eyes evolved in an environment with a dominant, intense, directional light source, the sun, that provides bright daytime illumination and is absent at night. Our eyes are optimized for daytime operation with a color sensing system and a spatial resolution designed for sunlit conditions. Our night vision is functional but clearly secondary. The rods that handle dim light vision are concentrated away from the center of the visual field, less sharp, colorblind, built for detecting motion and general shapes rather than fine detail and hue. Researchers have found that animals living in permanently dim environments develop fundamentally different visual systems. Deep-sea fish that inhabit the mesopelagic zone, the ocean layer between 200 and 1,000 meters where sunlight penetrates as a faint diffuse blue glow, rather than as a directional source, have eyes with vastly enlarged pupils, expanded retinas, with enormous rod densities and, in some species, tubular or cylindrical eye shapes that increase the effective aperture of the optical system without increasing its depth. They are built to collect every available photon at the expense of the color discrimination and high-resolution detail that brighter conditions would allow. Some deep-sea species have evolved two distinct retinal regions, one optimized for the faint downwelling, daylight from above, and one optimized for detecting bioluminescence from below the flashes and glows of other organisms in the dark. Their eyes are not one instrument but two each, calibrated for a different quality of light at a different brightness. Evidence suggests that eyes of this type, large, sensitive, multi-purpose, calibrated for dim conditions rather than bright ones, might be the dominant visual form on a world where the only light comes from stars, from bioluminescence, and from the faint glow of a distant Terminator. Not the forward-facing, colour-rich, high-acuity visual systems of predators adapted for daylight pursuit, but something larger, rounder, more open. Eyes that hold the dark gently the way a wide bowl holds water. Bioluminescence itself deserves a moment of quiet attention here, because on a world without sunlight it would likely play a role that is difficult to overstate. On Earth, bioluminescence is widespread but supplementary. It exists in the deep ocean, in certain fungi and fireflies, in some bacteria, and plankton in a handful of terrestrial organisms. It is used for communication, for camouflage, for attracting prey, for recognizing members of the same species. But it is always in competition with sunlight during the day and visible primarily at night or in darkness. On the dark side of a tidally locked planet, there is no competition. A bioluminescent organism there would be as visible in its environment as a lantern carried through a dark house. It would have the full attention of every eye capable of detecting it, because it would be the only light source in a world where light sources are extraordinarily rare. Researchers have observed that in the deep ocean where this is already the case, bioluminescence has diversified into an almost bewildering variety of forms and functions. Organisms use it to signal readiness to mate, to warn predators, to lure prey, to camouflage themselves against the faint light from above, to illuminate the territory immediately around them, to communicate in sequences too complex for us to fully decode yet. The light is a language in those places, a language written in the only medium available. On a dark planet, that language might expand to fill everything. The entire ecology of surface interaction, all the signalling and recognition and warning and attraction that on Earth is accomplished by colour and shape in sunlight, would be accomplished in the dark by light itself. The world would glow in places, quietly, in patterns, in the patient living vocabulary of organisms that had learned over enormous time to make their own illumination. The sky then on the dark side of a tidally locked world would not simply be dark, it would be full of fixed unmoving stars in densities and configurations no shifting sky ever holds in one view, full of the faint luminosity of the galaxy itself, spread overhead like a permanent slow brushstroke, lit, perhaps at one horizon, by the distant warmth of a Terminator glow. And below on the surface, interspersed in the landscape, the slow blink and pulse of bioluminescent life, writing its messages in the only light it has ever known. It would be a kind of beauty that our eyes are perhaps not fully equipped to appreciate, a beauty for larger, softer, more patient eyes than ours. For a visual system built not to catch fast movement in bright light, but to hold still in the dark and let the faint things accumulate, the mind quietly registers that this is not nothing, that a sky full of stars, fixed and permanent and unobscured, and a surface lit from within by living light is not an absence. It is a different presence, a different version of what it means to have a world, and what lives in that world beneath that sky with that light, what it does with its body, how it moves and breathes and keeps its time that unfolds in the next part of this slow, quiet drift through the dark. There is a cave in the south of France, not far from the Pyrenees, that has been used for an unusual kind of science. In the 1960s and 70s, a French researcher named Michel Siffre descended into it alone, severing all contact with the surface world above. No clock, no radio, no natural light of any kind, just a tent, a supply of food. Artificial lighting he could control himself, and the instruction to live according to his own body without any external sense of what time it was. He stayed for 2 months the first time, and what he found when he finally emerged and compared his subjective experience of time to the actual calendar was that his body had been running on its own schedule, one that drifted gradually away from the 24-hour cycle of the world above him, settling into a rhythm of its own that felt, from the inside, entirely normal. He thought he had been down there for about a month. He had been there for 2. His body had not broken without the cues of daylight. It had simply wandered. The human circadian system is a network of molecular clocks distributed throughout nearly every cell and organ in the body, coordinated by a small region in the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a cluster of roughly 20,000 neurons sitting just above the optic chiasm, which receives direct input from a specialized type of photoreceptor cell in the retina. These cells, called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, are sensitive to a specific wavelength of light in the blue range of the spectrum. When that light arrives in the morning, these cells send a signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which resets the central clock and cascades that reset through the peripheral clocks in organs throughout the body. The liver, the kidneys, the lungs, the immune system, the cardiovascular system, all of them run their own local versions of the circadian clock, coordinating the timing of their functions, the release of enzymes, the repair of cellular damage, the modulation of inflammation to a 24-hour schedule that is continuously synchronized by that central reset from the eyes. Researchers have found that when this synchronization breaks down, when the light signal is absent, delayed, or inconsistent, the peripheral clocks begin to drift relative to the central clock and relative to each other. The liver expects to process food at a different time than the stomach expects to receive it. The immune system is active at times when the body is trying to sleep. The production of hormones that regulate appetite, stress response, and cellular repair runs on a schedule increasingly misaligned with the actual demands of the moment. It seems that the circadian system is not just a convenience, a way of keeping track of time. It is a fundamental coordination mechanism without which the body's many subsystems begin to work at cross purposes. Studies conducted on people living in Arctic regions during the polar night, the period of weeks or months when the sun does not rise above the horizon, have offered some insight into what the long-term absence of the light signal does to human physiology. The results are more complex than a simple deterioration. Some individuals adapt relatively well, their bodies maintaining a reasonable approximation of normal circadian rhythm through a combination of artificial light, social cues, meal timing, and exercise schedules. Others experience significant disruption, irregular sleep, altered mood changes in appetite and energy, a blunting of the normal daily variation in alertness and cognitive function that most people experience without noticing it. What we understand so far suggests that social cues, the regular schedules imposed by other people, mealtimes, work routines, social interaction can partially substitute for the light signal in maintaining circadian synchrony. The body does not require the sun specifically. It requires a regular, reliable Zeitgeber, a German word used in chronobiology meaning literally time giver. Anything that provides a consistent rhythmic signal at the right frequency can to some degree serve the function that sunrise normally performs. For humans in the polar night, the Zeitgeber becomes artificial, an alarm clock, a structured schedule, a meal eaten at the same time every day, which is itself a potent entraining signal because the liver's clock is particularly sensitive to feeding time. These substitutions work imperfectly but meaningfully to keep the internal clocks from drifting too far. On a tidally locked world with no sunrise anywhere on the dark hemisphere, a civilized species, if one existed, might develop cultural and physiological rhythms built around whatever consistent signals their environment offered instead. The timing of chemical venting events in the rock beneath them, the rhythm of the winds from the Terminator, the regular bioluminescent displays of other organisms, anything predictable, anything periodic, anything that the body could use to know where it was in its own cycle. The architecture of sleep itself is worth pausing on here, because it is one of the places where the circadian system's absence would make its presence most felt. Human sleep is not a single uniform state. It is a structured sequence of stages cycling through lighter and deeper phases of non-rapid eye movement sleep and then into rapid eye movement sleep, with each cycle lasting roughly 90 minutes. and the composition of cycles changing across the night, more deep, slow wave sleep in the early cycles, more rapid eye movement sleep in the later cycles as morning approaches. This architecture is not random. It is the product of two interacting systems, the circadian drive, which determines the timing of sleep relative to the external light-dark cycle, and the homeostatic drive, which determines the depth and duration of sleep relative to how long the person has been awake. Neuroscientists have observed that the interaction between these two drives is remarkably precise in normal conditions. The circadian system, among other things, issues a wake-promoting signal in the late afternoon and early evening that counteracts the growing homeostatic sleep pressure accumulated over the waking day, keeping the person alert until a socially appropriate bedtime. Then, as the circadian signal withdraws in the late evening sleep, pressure prevails and sleep begins. The two systems work in opposition to produce a stable, well-timed alternation of sleep and waking that neither system alone could achieve. Without the light signal to calibrate the circadian drive, this interaction would become unstable. The timing of the circadian wake-promoting signal would drift. The relationship between the circadian and homeostatic systems would become variable. Sleep might come at different times in successive cycles in different amounts with different internal compositions. Not immediately catastrophic, but gradually accumulating into a pattern of rest that is less efficient, less restorative, less precisely matched to the body's actual repair needs. The brain tends to compensate up to a point. It is flexible. It finds new equilibria. But the compensation is never quite as good as the original calibration, and the studies of people on irregular schedules shift. Workers, frequent long-distance travelers, people living through extended polar nights suggest that the body carries the cost of that imprecision in subtle but real ways in the quality of cognitive function, in immune resilience, in the long-term maintenance of metabolic health. There is a particular detail in all of this that researchers have found unexpectedly moving in a scientific sort of way. The light-sensitive cells in the retina that reset the central clock, those intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, were not discovered until the early 2000s. For most of the history of vision science, the eye was understood to contain two types of photoreceptors, rods for dim light vision and cones for color and detail in bright conditions. That was the complete picture, or so it seemed. And then researchers found a third type. These cells do not contribute to vision in any way that the brain uses to form images. They do not tell you what you are seeing. They serve only one function, measuring the ambient light level, specifically in the blue range, and using that measurement to tell the brain what time of day it is. The eye contains a clock-setting mechanism entirely separate from its image-forming machinery. A dedicated system built for one purpose, running quietly behind everything else the eye does, noting the blue quality of morning light and sending its signal to the suprachiasmatic nucleus without ever contributing a single pixel to the visual scene. Evidence suggests that this system is extraordinarily ancient. The proteins involved in the photochemistry of these cells are related to proteins found in organisms that diverged from the vertebrate lineage hundreds of millions of years ago. The clock-setting eye is in some form older than the image-forming eye. The body learned to measure time from light before it learned to see with it. On a world without sunlight, that ancient time-measuring system would have nothing to measure, not broken, not absent, simply running with no input, drifting the way Michel Sifra drifted in his cave on its own schedule, finding its own pace, unanchored but persistent. The body keeping time in the dark because the machinery for it is too old and too fundamental to simply stop. It may be that any creature that evolved on a tidally locked dark world would carry somewhere in its biology a vestige of this kind. A system that was originally built to read light, repurposed over generations to read something else, but still carrying the faint signature of its original function. The way the human appendix carries the faint signature of a digestive organ, that was once more central to an ancestral diet. The way our goosebumps carry the signature of an ancestor whose hair stood on end to look larger and more threatening. The body accumulates its history quietly in structures that are no longer quite what they were but are not yet something entirely new. Psychologists often note that humans find this kind of evolutionary vestige touching in a way that is hard to explain, purely in terms of intellectual interest. There is something about the persistence of an old mechanism running faithfully in conditions that no longer match the ones it was designed for that resonates with something very human. The clock that keeps ticking after the bell stops ringing. The eye that keeps looking for light in the dark. There is one more dimension to this that is worth letting settle slowly before we move on. In the absence of a sunrise time itself would feel different. On Earth, the day provides not just a biological rhythm, but a narrative structure. Morning is a beginning. Something is expected to happen. Evening is a close. Something has finished. The sun provides not only a physiological Zeitgeber, but a psychological one, a sense of time moving forward of the day having a shape of now being located somewhere on an arc between start and finish. Without that arc time would have a different texture. Not better or worse necessarily, but different, more continuous, less divided into units with emotional weight attached to them. The quality of time in a perpetual night might be less like a series of days and more like a single very long moment differentiated by events rather than by the position of a star. What happened would matter, when in any astronomical sense would matter less. The mind quietly registers that we have some experience of this actually. The long hours of a sleepless night when time seems to thicken and slow, and the sequence of events becomes more salient than their clock positions. The absorption of deep work or deep play when hours pass without being counted. The particular quality of being very ill when the day loses its shape and time becomes simply a matter of what happens next. These are small, temporary versions of what would be the permanent condition on the dark side of a tidally locked world. And in them, if you stay with them rather than resisting them, there is often a strange, unexpected clarity. A presence to the moment that the structured day does not always provide. The body in the dark running its clock without an anchor drifting gently through its cycles, it is not lost. It is simply navigating by internal stars the way everything does, eventually when the external guides go quiet. And what the senses do in that navigation, what they reach for when the light is no longer available to orient them, drifts quietly into the next layer of this story. Next. There is a room in Minneapolis inside an engineering building at Orfield Laboratories that holds a particular distinction. It has been measured on multiple occasions as the quietest place on Earth. The walls, floor and ceiling are lined with fiberglass wedges nearly a metre long, angled to absorb sound rather than reflect it. The room sits on springs inside a second room, isolated from the vibrations of the building around it. No ventilation system runs while measurements are being taken. No light enters from outside. The room absorbs 99.99% of all sound that enters it, and what remains the residual noise floor is below the threshold of human hearing. People who sit in this room in total darkness for more than a few minutes begin to hear things that are not in any conventional sense there. They hear their own heartbeat, the sound of blood moving through the vessels of their inner ear, the faint creak of their joints when they shift position, the breath amplified enormously filling all the space that other sound normally occupies. And after a while longer, the nervous system, deprived of its accustomed input, begins to generate its own a faint sourceless hiss, a ringing that belongs to no external object, the auditory system producing signal where there is no signal to receive. Most people find they can tolerate the room for no more than 45 minutes, not because it is dangerous, because it is too quiet to be comfortable. The human brain, researchers have found, is not built for the absence of input. It is built for a world that is always making noise, always providing something to process, always filling the senses with enough to keep the monitoring systems occupied. Take that away, and the brain does not rest. It reaches. What happens to the senses in the absence of their primary inputs is one of the more fascinating areas of neuroscience, and it speaks directly to what life on a permanently dark world might look, sound, and feel like, not in the visual sense, but in the full bodily sense of existing somewhere. The principle involved is called cross-modal plasticity, the reorganization of sensory brain regions in response to the loss or reduction of input from their primary modality. Neuroscientists have observed this most clearly in studies of people who are born blind or who lose their vision early in life. In these individuals, the visual cortex, that large region at the back of the brain devoted to processing visual information, does not simply sit idle. It is recruited by other senses. It begins to process touch or sound or language or spatial information derived from non-visual cues. The neural territory dedicated to sight is repurposed in the living brain for whatever work needs doing. The result is not a brain with a hole in it. It is a brain that has reorganized itself quietly and efficiently to extract maximum information from the senses that still provide input. And the senses that take over the visual cortex's territory do not merely continue at their previous level of function, they improve. The tactile discrimination of proficient Braille readers who use their fingertips to read printed text at high speed engages the visual cortex extensively, and the spatial resolution of touch in those fingertips exceeds what is typical for sighted people by a measurable margin. The auditory localization abilities of people who have been blind from birth are on average more precise than those of people who became blind later in life, suggesting that the earlier the reorganization begins, the more fully the visual cortex can be co-opted for auditory spatial processing. The brain, in other words, does not waste real estate. Territory is territory. Whatever sense is producing useful information will, given enough time and pressure, find ways to use more of it. On the dark side of a tidally locked planet, this principle would operate not just across individual lifetimes, but across evolutionary time. Generation by generation, any creature that extracted more useful information from sound or smell or touch, or pressure sensitivity or chemical detection, or whatever other modalities the environment offered, would navigate slightly better, find food, slightly more reliably avoid danger, slightly more efficiently, and produce slightly more offspring. The gradients would be small at first, almost imperceptible from one generation to the next. But over thousands of generations, over millions of years, those small gradients accumulate into large differences. The auditory processing regions grow. The olfactory bulb, if the creature has one, expands. New receptor types emerge sensitive to signals that were too faint to matter in a world with vision, but are critical in a world without it. This is not speculation. It has already happened here in the caves and deep oceans and perpetual dark of this planet. The lateral line of the cave fish, the expanded chemosensory systems of cave salamanders, the echolocation of bats and dolphins, the electroreception of sharks, which can detect the electrical fields generated by the heartbeats of prey buried in sand. Every one of these systems is the solution to the problem of navigating and finding resources in a world where light is absent or insufficient. Every one of them represents neural territory accumulated over evolutionary time devoted to making the dark legible. On a world where the dark has always been the entire world, the solutions might be far more elaborate than anything evolution has had time to produce here. Senses we have no names for because we have no experience of their outputs. Ways of reading the environment that would be to a creature evolved in light as incomprehensible as colour is to someone who has never seen it, not absent, not lesser, simply different in a way that language cannot easily bridge. Smell deserves particular attention here, because it is among the human senses the one already most oriented toward chemical information, toward reading the molecular composition of the world, rather than its optical or acoustic properties. The human olfactory system contains roughly 400 types of olfactory receptors proteins, each sensitive to a different range of molecular shapes. The combinations of signals from these receptors allow humans to discriminate, in principle, an enormous number of distinct odors. Estimates range widely, but some researchers suggest the number may be in the trillions of distinguishable combinations, though the practical number of odors most people can reliably identify and name is much smaller. The system is ancient, far older than our visual system in its current form, and it connects directly to the limbic system, the brain structures involved in emotion and memory, in a way that the other senses do not. Smell reaches the brain's emotional centers before it is processed cognitively, which is why a scent can produce a feeling or a memory before you have had time to identify what you're smelling. In mammals with highly developed olfactory systems, dogs are the most familiar example. The olfactory bulb, the brain structure that processes smell signals, is proportionally enormous. A dog's olfactory epithelium, the sensory tissue in the nasal cavity, is roughly 40 times larger than a human's. The number of olfactory receptor neurons is perhaps 50 times greater, and the proportion of the brain devoted to processing olfactory information is correspondingly much larger. Dogs navigate a richly detailed chemical landscape that is entirely invisible to human perception, a world of scent trails hours or days old of emotional states encoded in the chemical composition of another animal's sweat, of the specific individual identity carried in the molecules shed by skin cells. It may be that on a dark planet, olfaction would occupy the cognitive role that vision occupies in human life, not just a supplement to other information, but the primary medium through which the world is read. The primary way that space is mapped, that individuals are recognized, that food and danger and shelter are located. A creature with olfactory processing as elaborated as our visual processing would inhabit a world of extraordinary chemical richness and complexity, organized entirely differently from anything we perceive, but no less detailed and no less functional. Sound too would carry a different weight in a world of permanent dark. Studies indicate that in environments where vision is absent, sound not only becomes more important for practical navigation, but takes on functions that vision normally serves for social communication. Human beings who are born deaf and develop signed languages show that the brain's language processing regions normally associated with auditory language will process visual spatial information instead, when that is the medium through which language is delivered. The architecture of language in the brain is modality independent. It is built for structure and meaning, not for any particular sensory channel. In a dark world, the acoustic channel would likely carry the full weight of social communication, not just simple signals, but the complex structured communication that makes collective behavior possible. The brain regions devoted to processing sound would expand to accommodate that complexity, the way the human brain's language areas expanded to accommodate the complexity of human speech. And the sounds themselves would evolve alongside the brains that produce and receive them, becoming richer, more structured, more layered with meaning, more precisely calibrated to the acoustic properties of whatever environment the creatures inhabited. What we understand so far suggests that the relationship between the structure of a sensory environment and the structure of the mind that develops within it is intimate and bidirectional. The environment shapes the mind by providing certain kinds of input and withholding others. The mind shapes the environment over evolutionary time by selectively attending to certain features and encoding them in our behavior. On a dark world, the acoustic and chemical landscape would be shaped over millions of years by the organisms that inhabited it, their calls and their chemical signals accumulating into a complex layered information environment that later organisms would inherit and add to. The darkness, in this sense, would not be a blank, it would be a medium. Rich, textured, full of signal organised by the long history of organisms that had learned to use it. There is a practice in certain contemplative traditions found in various forms across different cultures of deliberate sensory deprivation. Sitting in darkness and silence, sometimes for extended periods, as a way of turning attention inwards, away from the constant stream of external input that normally occupies the mind. The traditions describe it in different ways in different vocabularies, but the experience they point towards tends to have certain consistent features: an initial restlessness as the mind protests the withdrawal of its accustomed input, then gradually a quieting, and then sometimes a different quality of attention, broader, less focused on any particular object, more aware of awareness itself. Psychologists often note that this description matches at least superficially what neuroscience knows about the default mode network, a set of brain regions that become more active when external task demands decrease, when attention is not directed at any specific object in the environment. The default mode network appears to be involved in self-referential thought, in the consolidation of memory, in the generation of what might loosely be called the sense of self. It is most active not when the mind is busy with the world, but when the world has gone quiet enough for the mind to turn back on itself. On a dark world with no visual stream of information continuously occupying the attention-directing systems of the brain, the default mode network equivalent might run closer to its full capacity more of the time. Not because the creature would be unoccupied, the chemical and acoustic world around it would provide plenty to process, but because the particular kind of fast-focused, visually driven attention that dominates human waking life would simply not exist. The attentional style might be different from the ground up, less targeted, more ambient, more aware perhaps of the background of experience rather than any single foreground object. It is impossible to know what that would feel like from inside, but it is not impossible to notice in the dark and quiet of this particular room something of that quality beginning to arrive. The senses, when the world goes dark and still do not go quiet, they open, they reach, they find what is there rather than waiting for what is usually there. And the mind following the senses does the same, turning towards a layer of experience that is always present but usually overlooked, waiting patiently beneath the surface of the ordinary. The mind, it seems, has been keeping something still and patient all along, a quieter way of knowing the world, one that the darkness simply gives it permission to remember. There is a town in northern Norway called Tromsø, sitting at nearly 70 degrees north latitude, well above the Arctic Circle. From late November through late January, the sun does not rise above the horizon there at all. Not partially, not briefly, it simply does not come. The sky lightens a little around midday, a pale blue-grey wash that lasts for an hour or two before fading back into dark, but the sun itself stays below the edge of the world for roughly 2 months of every year. The people of Tromsø have lived with this for as long as people have lived there, which is a very long time. What researchers who study these communities have found is not the social collapse or pervasive despair that outsiders sometimes imagine. What they've found instead is adaptation, cultural, architectural, behavioral and physiological, of a kind that is quiet, practical, and in many ways instructive about what human beings are actually capable of when the sky stops cooperating. The people of Tromsø light their homes differently. They gather differently, they have developed collectively, and over generations, a relationship with darkness that is less adversarial than it is in places where the dark is a temporary visitor rather than a seasonal resident. The darkness is not fought, it is furnished. This image, a human community that has built its life around the permanent or semi-permanent absence of sunlight, is one of the best starting points we have for imagining what settlement on a tidally locked world's dark side might actually look like. Not because it is identical, but because it shows in miniature, and in a context we can observe directly how human beings respond when the light withdraws and does not return on its usual schedule. The architectural response to polar darkness is immediate and practical. Buildings in high-latitude Arctic communities tend to have larger windows than comparable buildings at lower latitudes, not because there is more light to let in, but because whatever light exists is so valuable that every opportunity to capture it matters. Reflective surfaces are used extensively indoors and out to distribute that limited light as widely as possible. Light-coloured interior walls mirrors placed to bounce whatever comes through the window into the corners of a room, reflective materials on outdoor surfaces to extend the reach of artificial lighting at night. Researchers have found that the quality of artificial light matters enormously in these environments in ways that go far beyond simple brightness. Light in the blue wavelength range, the same range that the clock-setting photoreceptors in the retina are sensitive to, affects mood alertness and the timing of melatonin production in ways that warm-toned incandescent light does not. Arctic communities and research stations have over the decades developed sophisticated lighting protocols that use spectrally calibrated artificial light to partially substitute for the absent sun or delivering blue-enriched light during the hours designated as day, and shifting to warmer, dimmer light in the evening to allow the circadian system to begin its approach towards sleep. What this represents in practical terms is the deliberate engineering of a biological environment, not just shelter from weather, which is what architecture has always provided, but management of the light signal itself, the calibration of the internal clock, the regulation of the body's chemistry through the careful design of the luminous environment. The building becomes in a sense a machine for maintaining human biology in conditions that would otherwise undermine it. On a dark world, this would not be supplementary, it would be foundational. The entire built environment would be designed from the first principle around the problem of providing the body with the rhythmic light signal it needs in a world that provides none. The social structures of high-latitude communities offer another kind of evidence about what dark world settlements might look like. Studies indicate that in communities where the external light cycle is absent or severely reduced social rhythms, the timing of shared activities, the structure of communal meals, the organization of work and rest take on a greater role in maintaining individual circadian health than they do in communities with normal day-night cycles. The meal eaten together at a regular time, the communal gathering in the evening, the shared schedule that gives the day its shape even when the sky provides none. These are not merely cultural preferences, they are in the context of polar darkness functional substitutes for the absent Zeitgeber. There is something quietly interesting in the observation that social connection, the simple fact of being with others on a shared schedule, has measurable effects on circadian synchrony. Researchers have found that people living alone during polar nights tend to experience more circadian disruption than people living in households or communities with regular shared schedules. The presence of other people with their own bodily rhythms and behavioral cues provides a kind of biological scaffolding that partially replaces the absent sun. On a dark world, the architecture of social life might be shaped by this reality in ways that permeate the entire culture. Not just meal times and work schedules, but ritual, ceremony, the regular shared activity that is not merely practical, but that serves the deeper function of keeping many bodies synchronized to the same rhythm in the absence of the astronomical rhythm that usually performs that function. The communal fire, if such a thing existed on a dark world, would be not only a source of warmth and light, but a social timekeeper. A reason to gather at the same moment again and again in a world that otherwise offers no reason to prefer one moment over another. Architecture on a dark world would solve problems that architecture on Earth has never needed to address. The problem of light, as discussed, would be central, but there would also be the problem of orientation. On Earth, the design of buildings and cities assumes that inhabitants have access to positional cues from the environment, the sun, which tells you east from west, stars which drift and can be used for navigation, the general direction of warmth and light. Even in a city of identical streets, the position of the sun at different times of day provides a constant reminder of where you are relative to the larger geography. On the dark side of a tidally locked planet with a fixed and unmoving star, sky orientation would be based entirely on those fixed stars and on the consistent direction of the terminator glow if it was visible from the settlement's location. The built environment might encode these directions explicitly, buildings oriented along specific astronomical axes pathways that align with the direction of the terminator landmarks, designed to be identifiable by chemical scent or acoustic echo rather than visual appearance. Scientists suggest that any sufficiently advanced civilization on such a world would develop navigation technologies early, for the same reason that maritime civilizations on Earth develop navigation technologies early, because the environment provides few landmarks and movement requires a reliable way to know where you are, relative to where you are going. On Earth, maritime navigation developed in response to the featureless ocean. On a dark world, the entire surface would be, in visual terms, something like an ocean uniform difficult to read at a glance, requiring instruments or training or both to navigate confidently. The map in such a culture might be the central artifact. Not a luxury or a specialized tool, but a fundamental technology. The knowledge of where things are encoded and shared and maintained across generations with care, proportional to how completely inaccessible that knowledge would be without it. There is a research station in Antarctica called Concordia, jointly operated by France and Italy, that sits on a plateau at an altitude of roughly 3,200 meters above sea level, more than 1,000 kilometers from the nearest coast. It's one of the most isolated places where human beings have voluntarily chosen to spend extended time. During the Antarctic winter, a crew of typically 13 to 16 people lives there for about 9 months, with no possibility of evacuation in temperatures that can fall below minus 80 degrees Celsius in darkness that last for more than 3 months. They cannot leave. New people cannot arrive. Whatever is needed, either in terms of supplies or social support, must come from within the station itself. Researchers from the European Space Agency study the Concordia crew carefully because the conditions there are considered among the closest approximations available on Earth to the psychological and physiological conditions of long-duration spaceflight, or potentially of permanent settlement in an environment radically different from the one human beings evolved for. What those studies have revealed over years of careful observation is a portrait of human adaptability under extraordinary pressure. The crew members develop intense social bonds of the kind that form when a small group of people are dependent on one another for survival over an extended period. They develop rituals, elaborate, carefully maintained routines around meals, work schedules, leisure time, the marking of milestones that serve to organize time and create a sense of structure and meaning in an environment that provides very little of either from outside. Evidence suggests that the most psychologically resilient crew members tend to be those who are most capable of what psychologists call autonomous regulation, the ability to maintain a sense of purpose and direction from internal sources when external sources are unavailable. Not people who are indifferent to their environment, but people who can find the rhythm inside themselves when the environment offers none. That capacity internal regulation, the ability to keep one's own time in the absence of external cues, is one that the Concordia researchers consider essential for any human community that might one day live in a permanently dark environment. Not a personality trait that some people happen to have, but a skill that can be cultivated. A way of being in the world that the dark teaches and that those who spend time in it tend gradually to learn. There is a detail from the Concordia studies that stays with you once you learn it. The station has a small greenhouse. In a place where no food grows and nothing is green for most of the year, the crew maintains a greenhouse, and they treat it with a care that is by any practical measure disproportionate to its output. It does not produce enough food to matter much nutritionally, but what it produces matters in other ways, in the scent of growing things, in the evidence of biological process, in the simple fact of something alive and changing in a place that is otherwise static and unchanging. Researchers have noted that the greenhouse appears to serve an important psychological function quite apart from its agricultural one. The presence of growing plants, organisms with their own cycles of growth and change, unrelated to the human occupants, seems to provide something that the human mind needs in isolated static environments. A reminder that time moves, that things change, that the world is not frozen in the present moment but is always quietly becoming something else. What we understand so far suggests that human beings, even those capable of remarkable autonomous regulation, need some evidence of process of change of life occurring independently of their own intentions, not necessarily visual evidence, but evidence, a chemical signal from the soil, the faint sound of leaves disturbed by the station's air circulation, the regular presence of something that is growing because it needs to, not because anyone decided it should. On a dark world, the equivalent might be whatever organisms existed in the settlement's immediate environment. The bioluminescent patterns of nearby creatures, the chemical signals of microbial communities in the surrounding rock, the rhythm of wind from the terminator arriving and departing on its own schedule. The settlers would not be the only living things there, and the presence of the other living things in whatever form they took would matter, not as a resource exactly, but as company, as evidence that this world, this permanent night, is not a place where nothing happens. It is simply a place where what happens is different. The mind is a creature of context. It reads the environment around it and uses what it finds to calibrate not just behavior but identity, the sense of who one is, where one is, what time it is in the large sense. In an environment without the usual cues, it builds new ones or borrows them from wherever they can be found, from other people, from shared schedules, from the growth of a plant in a small glass room, from the rhythm of wind that comes from the direction of the glow on the horizon, bringing warmth that no one ordered and no one could prevent. The human capacity for that kind of improvised calibration is one of the quieter forms of resilience that the dark brings out. Not dramatic, not visible from outside, but real and deep and surprisingly enduring. And beneath that resilience, beneath the architecture and the ritual and the carefully maintained greenhouse, there is another kind of relationship with the dark one that goes further back than any settlement, any station, any human plan. Something that the stars themselves have been holding patiently for whoever finally learned to look up. There is a quality to starlight that is different from every other kind of light. Not in its physics exactly, photons are photons, and the ones arriving from a star 40 light years away are not fundamentally different from the ones produced by a lamp on a bedside table. The difference is in what they carry, the age of them, the distance, the fact that each point of light in the night sky is not a reflection or a projection, but a source, an original burning thing, producing its own energy, sending it outward in all directions across distances so large that the numbers lose their meaning before they finish being said. When you look at a star, you are not looking at a picture of something. You are receiving something that left its origin years or centuries or millennia before you were born, travelling in a straight line through space with no particular intention of arriving anywhere, and arriving here at your eye at this moment by the simple geometry of the universe. That has always seemed to people who think carefully about it like something worth noticing. On the dark side of a tidally locked planet, the stars would not be an occasional luxury, a reward for staying up late on a clear night. They would be the sky, every night, every hour. The complete and permanent sealing of the world, unchanging in position, unobscured by the rising of a brighter source, available always to whatever minds existed below them, in a way that the stars have never been available to minds on a world like ours. Researchers who study the history of astronomy on Earth note something consistent across culture. Wherever human beings have had reliable access to clear dark skies, they have developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The Polynesian navigators who crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean without instruments, using the positions and rising points of stars they had memorized with a precision that still astonishes modern navigators. The ancient communities in the Sahara and the Arabian Peninsula who mapped the night sky in detail centuries before the development of optical instruments naming stars and tracking their movements with accuracy that was not improved upon for a very long time. The Aboriginal Australians, whose astronomical traditions extend back tens of thousands of years and include detailed knowledge of stellar cycles, planetary movements, and the structure of the Milky Way encoded in oral traditions and embedded in the landscape itself. What all of these traditions share is the precondition of darkness. Reliable, deep, uninterrupted darkness available regularly that allowed generations of observers to accumulate knowledge that no single lifetime could produce. The stars taught the people who watched them long enough and carefully enough and in sufficient darkness to see what was actually there. On a dark world that a precondition would be absolute and permanent, the darkness would never lift, the stars would never be obscured by a rising sun, and the minds below them would have in every generation the same uninterrupted access to the same unmoving sky that their ancestors had. Not a resource that had to be sought out or waited for or protected from light pollution, simply the world as it always was. The astronomy that would develop on such a world would be from its very beginning more intimate than ours. Consider what human astronomy lost when artificial lighting spread across the surface of the Earth. The stars did not go away, but their visibility did for the majority of the human population which now lives in cities and suburbs, where the diffuse glow of artificial light washes out everything fainter than the brightest stars. A child growing up in a modern city might see 50 stars on a clear night. A child growing up in a truly dark place might see 4,000. The difference between those two skies is not merely quantitative, it is qualitative, a different relationship to the universe, a different intuitive understanding of scale and distance and the structure of the galaxy, simply from having seen more of it from the beginning. Evidence suggests that regular exposure to the full night sky, the kind of sky visible from truly dark locations, has measurable effects on the experience of what researchers sometimes call awe, a specific emotional and cognitive state characterized by a sense of vastness, a challenge to the ordinary sense of scale, and a temporary dissolution of the usual preoccupation with the immediate self. Studies in this area indicate that experiences of awe have downstream effects on cognition, a broadening of perspective, a reduction in the salience of moment-to-moment concerns, an increase in affiliative behavior, a tendency to place individual events in a larger context. The brain tends to interpret the vast and the ancient as information about its own smallness, and that information counterintuitively tends to produce not distress, but something closer to relief. The weight of the individual moment with all its particular anxieties and preoccupations becomes lighter when held against something genuinely measurably enormous. On a dark world, that perspective, the awe of the permanent, unobscured sky would not be a rare experience or a deliberate practice. It would be the baseline, the ordinary condition of standing outside or looking up through whatever transparent surface covered a settlement ceiling. The universe in all its depth and age and silence would be a constant presence rather than an occasional visitor. What that does to a mind accumulated over a lifetime is difficult to say precisely, but it seems likely that it would produce a different relationship with time, with scale, with the question of what matters, and for how long. The specific stars visible from a dark-side settlement would depend on the planet's position and orientation, but certain features of any such sky would be consistent. The Milky Way. The structure of our own galaxy, visible from Earth as a faint band of diffuse light across the sky, would be visible from any planet within it that had a sufficiently dark sky. On a tidally locked dark world, the Milky Way would not rotate overhead during the night, because there is no night and day. It would simply be there always in the same position, the same band of ancient light, spanning the sky from one horizon to another. Over a human lifetime of looking at it, the structure would become familiar in a way that it almost never becomes familiar on Earth, where the rotation of the planet moves it across the sky each night and the cycle of the seasons changes which portion faces the darkened side of the Earth. Researchers have found that the Milky Way is not uniform. It has structure density variations, dark lanes of obscuring dust regions of higher and lower stellar density, the occasional faint smear of a satellite galaxy visible to the naked eye under very dark conditions. A lifetime of observation of this fixed permanent band would reveal those details gradually with the patient accumulation of attention that is possible only when the object of study is always available and never hurrying away. The planets of that solar system, if there were other planets, would move against this fixed background on their orbital schedules, their positions changing slowly over days and weeks, tracing paths that would be far easier to study and understand from a sky that never moves than from a sky that rotates. Ancient astronomers on Earth worked for centuries to understand the motion of the planets against the moving background of our rotating sky. From a dark world's fixed sky, the mathematics of planetary motion might be intuitive long before it became formal, visible in the long-term memory of communities that had watched the same sky for generations. There is a subtler kind of astronomical knowledge that a permanent dark sky would make possible, one that is difficult even to fully appreciate from our situation. Variable stars. Stars that change in brightness over time for various reasons are one of the most information-rich classes of objects in the sky. Some vary because they pulse expanding and contracting in a regular cycle. Some because they are in binary systems where one star periodically eclipses the other. Some because they have star spots, large dark regions on their surfaces that rotate in and out of view. The measurement of these variations, carried out over long periods of time, allows astronomers to determine the size, mass, temperature, and distance of stars with great precision. On Earth, this kind of measurement requires dedicated instruments and careful record-keeping across many nights and many years. The sky is only accessible for observation for part of each 24-hour period, and then only when weather cooperates. Continuous monitoring of a single star is essentially impossible without automated instruments. From a dark world's surface with no day-night cycle to interrupt observations and no seasonal changes in which portion of the sky is accessible, a careful observer could watch a variable star every hour for a lifetime. The data accumulated would be extraordinary in its density and continuity. The patterns would emerge in years rather than centuries. The models that explain them would be testable with a thoroughness that terrestrial astronomy has never achieved through ground-based observation alone. Scientists suggest, in the context of the search for biosignatures in exoplanet atmospheres, that the quality of astronomical data available from a dark world might be in some specific ways superior to anything achievable from a sunlit world. Not across all of astronomy, but for those particular tasks that require long, uninterrupted, high-quality observations of faint, slowly varying sources. The permanent dark is not only a challenge for the life that exists within it, it is for certain purposes an advantage. There is one more thing about the sky of a dark world that deserves to be held gently before we let this section rest. The star that the planet orbits, the star that never rises above the horizon of the dark side that exists always on the other face of the world, would be visible only from the terminator, from the edge, from the thin ring of the world where the dark side and the bright side press against each other in permanent twilight, and from that edge The star would hang exactly at the horizon, neither rising nor setting the same in every direction along the terminator line, a continuous band of light encircling the world at the planet's equatorial margin. For anyone who had travelled from the deep dark to the edge, the sight of that star neither above nor below present, and yet not fully present, illuminating the sky at the horizon, without rising into it, would be unlike anything visible from the dark side's interior. A star at the horizon all the way around the world, a permanent sunrise and sunset simultaneously everywhere at once along the terminator going nowhere, changing nothing, simply existing in that state of permanent and impossible threshold. It seems that this image, the star held at the horizon, never rising, never setting, always there at the edge of the world, says something that is difficult to put into words, but that the mind quietly recognizes. Something about how the things that give us light and warmth are not always the things that are closest to us. Something about how the edge of the world is not a limit, but a different kind of presence. Something about how even from the deepest dark the light is there, just at the boundary, permanent and patient. The sky of a dark world would be in the end not a deprivation. It would be a gift of a specific kind, the gift of everything that is only visible when the nearest, brightest, most dominating source of light is absent. The fainter things, the older things, the things that have always been there that a bright sky simply drowns out. From the dark you see further, not because the dark makes you sharper, but because it removes what was always in the way. What we understand so far suggests that this is true not just of stars, but of the mind itself, that in the quieting of the immediate and the close something older and further becomes perceptible. Something that the busy lit world was always covering without either of you noticing. The stars would know the dark world inhabitants the way the dark world inhabitants would know the stars thoroughly over long time, with the patient attention that only constancy allows. And from that knowing, from that long uninterrupted conversation between a mind and the sky, it has always lived under something settles, something releases, the way understanding when it finally arrives does not arrive loudly, but simply makes itself quietly at home in the space that was always waiting for it. That settling the way a world and a life and a mind finally finds its rest in the dark it was given drifts now toward its last and softest place. There is a particular kind of beauty that only reveals itself slowly. Not the kind that arrives all at once, the sudden view from a mountain, the sky on fire at sunset, the thing that takes the breath away before the mind has had time to prepare. This is a different kind, the kind that accumulates. That asked you to stay in one place long enough for the layers to become visible one by one in no hurry on their own schedule. The dark side of a tidally locked world would be that kind of beautiful. Not immediately, not from a distance, not on first encounter when the cold and the stillness and the fixed, unmoving sky might seem like nothing more than absence. But over time, over the long, unhurried time that such a world provides in abundance, the beauty would arrive in layers, each one resting gently on the one before, until the whole of it became something that could not be seen from outside, only from within. Scientists who model the geology of tidally locked planets have found that the dark side, despite its stillness, would not be geologically inert. The interior of any rocky planet generates heat through the slow decay of radioactive elements distributed through the mantle and crust, a process that continues regardless of what the surface looks like, regardless of whether a sun is shining on it or not. That internal heat drives geological activity, the slow movement of tectonic plates, the occasional volcanic event, the gradual reshaping of the surface over geological time. On the dark side, where there is no solar heating to complicate the picture, this internal heat would be the dominant geological force, and its signature would be visible at the surface in particular ways. Researchers have found that in the absence of strong surface heating, the internal heat of a planet tends to express itself more uniformly, spreading out through the crust in a more even distribution, rather than being masked or concentrated by surface temperature patterns. The result in some models is a surface that is geothermally active in a quiet, diffuse way across large areas, rather than concentrated at specific volcanic hotspots. Warm ground in places, not hot enough to be dangerous, but measurably warmer than the surface temperature that the cold alone would produce. Small emissions of gas from cracks in the rock, the faint sourceless warmth of a planet that is heating itself from the inside, paying no attention at all to the star it orbits. For anything living on that surface, that warmth would be intimate in a way that sunlight never is. Sunlight falls from above, from a distance, impersonal and vast. Geothermal warmth rises from below, from the body of the world itself, as if the ground were alive and warm-blooded, as if the planet were in some very loose metaphorical sense delivering the things that Underneath, the chemistry of the dark side's surface would also, over geological time, develop a character of its own. On the sunlit side of the planet, photochemistry chemical reactions driven by the energy of photons would continuously produce reactive compounds breaking molecular bonds and forming new ones in the energetic environment near the substellar point. Some of those compounds would be carried by the atmospheric circulation across the terminator and deposited on the dark side where the chemistry is slower and cooler and the reactive materials can accumulate rather than immediately being broken down again. What we understand so far suggests that this deposition would over millions of years create a surface chemistry on the dark side that is meaningfully different from anything on the sunlit side, richer in certain complex molecules, more varied in the organic compounds present in the soil and rock, a surface that is in chemical terms partly a product of the light it has never received, directly receiving the gifts of photochemistry second-hand via the wind and keeping them in the cold where they persist. This is not unlike what happens in certain cold, dark environments on Earth. The deep ocean floor receives organic material produced at the sunlit surface, transported downward through the water column, preserved by cold and pressure in ways that the energetic surface environment would not permit. The deep ocean is in a sense the archive of the surface, slower, colder, more patient, accumulating what falls from above and holding it. The dark side of a tidally locked world might be something like that. An archive of the chemistry that happens in the light preserved in the dark, rearranged by geological time into forms that the original photochemistry never produced directly. It may be that the most interesting chemistry on such a world, the chemistry that is most likely to have the kind of complexity that biology eventually requires, would be neither on the sunlit side where energy is too intense and reactions happen too fast, nor on the deep, dark side where everything is too cold and too slow, but somewhere in between, near the terminator, in the zone where the gifts of the light and the patience of the dark combine. Researchers have noted, when thinking about the origins of life in extreme environments generally, that the most productive chemical environments tend to be those where there is a regular alternation between different conditions, wet and dry, hot and cold, energized and quiescent. That alternation drives chemistry through cycles, concentrating molecules, driving reactions forward, providing the repetition that allows complex structures to build up gradually from simpler ones. The terminator of a tidally locked planet where the wind from the bright side arrives and the cold from the dark side presses back, where chemistry deposits and reactions proceed, and the conditions change with the slow variation of the atmospheric circulation, that zone might provide its own version of the alternation that life needs. Not the alternation of day and night as on Earth, but an alternation nonetheless, driven by geography rather than by rotation, permanent rather than cyclical, a different rhythm arriving at some of the same results. There is a word that astronomers use sometimes in the context of the search for life beyond Earth. The word is habitable, and it has always carried underneath its technical meaning a quietly emotional one. To call a world habitable is to say that it could be lived in. Not just that life might chemically persist there, but that something could make a home of it, could find it over time workable, could learn its rhythms, adapt to its temperatures, read its sky, use its chemistry, build something within it that is more than mere survival. What we understand so far suggests that the dark side of a tidally locked world might, under the right conditions, meet that definition. Not easily, not in all cases, not in the way a temperate Earth-like world might, but in its own way, on its own terms, by the patient logic of a universe that does not require any particular set of conditions for life to find a foothold, only that some conditions persist long enough and that some chemistry remains possible. And the life that found its foothold there, if any did, would not experience its world as a compromise. It would experience it as the world, the only world. The one it had always known, with all its particular features settled into the category of simply how things are. The fixed stars would not be a curiosity, they would be the sky. The geothermal warmth rising through the ground would not be remarkable. It would be what warmth means. The chemical signals carried on the wind from the Terminator would not be exotic, they would be the smell of the air. And the darkness, the permanent, patient, star-filled darkness, would not be an absence, it would be home. We have been travelling through that darkness for a long time now, through the cold and the wind and the chemistry, through the caves and the deep ocean vents, through the body's ancient clock running faithfully in the dark, through the senses that open when the light withdraws, through the settlements that light themselves from within, and the skies that reveal more the darker they become. And somewhere in all of that, something quiet has been building. Not an argument, not a conclusion, just a feeling arriving slowly the way the dark side's beauty would arrive, in layers, without hurry. The feeling that the dark is not what we usually think it is. It is not the absence of light. It is what the light gives way to when it has finished its work. When the star sets or turns away, or is simply never there to begin with. The dark is what persists, what waits, what holds everything that light cannot reach and does not need to. The universe is in the most literal, measurable sense, mostly dark. The light is the minority. The stars, for all their number, occupy a vanishingly small fraction of the volume of space. The vast remainder is not lit. It is simply there, patient and enormous, older than the stars within it, extending in every direction further than any measurement has yet reached. And in that darkness something keeps happening. Chemistry, gravity, the slow accumulation of matter into structures, the patient work of a universe that does not require light to continue. We are made of the same materials as that universe. The same atoms, the same patterns, the same slow processes running inside our cells in the dark, whether we are awake or not. The breath slows now. The body has been settling for a long time, following the rhythm of something older than thought. The stars on that here dark world are still there, fixed, patient, unmoving above a surface where something small and quiet is going about its work. The wind from the Terminator is still moving, carrying warmth into the cold. The chemistry is still proceeding, slowly, without hurry, without anyone watching, and here in this dark room the same patience exists. The body knows how to do this part. It has always known. The clock runs, the breath moves, the dark holds everything gently the way it always has, the way it always will. Somewhere a planet turns its face away from its star, and the stars come out, all of them fixed and clear and very far away, and something below them is still. And that is enough. That has always been enough.